Thanks for coming. Let's try to get started on time here. Got a lot of slides to go through. This is test suite. I'm Dan Guerin. I'm an engineer with Civic Actions. We're an open, agile digital government services agency. And we've also just taken on stewardship of the DCAN Open Data Project. I'm also a Drupal Camp Asheville organizer. And if you want to pencil in your calendar for July 13th and 14th, try to beat the heat, come up to Asheville. We have bears and beers. So. Let's see, last time I checked, my Twitter account had not inadvertently been deleted. It's at dguerin. And pretty much everywhere else, I'm Dan Gur. So today we'll talk about test-driven development. And at Civic Actions, we prefer free and open source software. So we'll be focusing on testing software that meets that criteria. First, we'll take a look at behavioral testing. It's typically easier to write and to understand. Can apply to site building activities. It can take a little bit longer to run just because they're fully bootstrapped and has to go through all of the Drupal processes. We'll also take a look at visual regression testing briefly, which compares snapshots of the site before and after changes. It's a good low-touch way to get a lot of code coverage. And then we'll take a look at unit tests. They're typically faster to run and more targeted. Usually makes more sense when you're writing custom code. And if you have core and contrib code, it's usually included already within that is unit tests, so you usually don't have to worry about that. All right, so starting out with behavioral, the Bhat Drupal extension is probably the way to go. It helps you define functionality and the changes that happen. You can also provide steps with contrib modules and themes if you have those. It's in a very plain language that everyone can understand and provides a lot of different scenarios that are pretty typical that we use as Drupalists. We'll take a look at some of these as we go on, and it's also extensible. So this is a template of what your Bhat test might look like. The feature is the high-level user story format, and then you'll have scenarios under that. Typically, we'll have multiple scenarios for each feature. And it kind of looks like a user acceptance test, but it's automated. So you can also add ands. So you have, you typically will have like a given, when, and then. Let's see if I can find the pointer here. Given, when, and then. You can also add in ands and buts. There are no buts in here, but you can put those in. They pretty much all do the same thing, so they're interchangeable. Those are the keywords that will start each of the lines. And if you're like me, you might go to write your first test and it won't work. So you can add in, put in at API at the top here and that'll probably make it work to use the Drupal or the Drush driver, depending on how you have your configuration set up. That's just one of the tags that you can use. You can put tags at the top of scenarios and the line above. You can also use @JavaScript if you need to include JavaScript for your tests. And you can use tags for grouping tests. So if you wanted to just run tests for a database or form, you could do that. And also hooks are another use for tags. So you can run certain tests at certain times. So before or after Drupal functions, or before or after scenarios or features. This is a rundown of the drivers you'll probably be using. The black box is the default. And typically for tests that don't require authentication or access, such as anonymous users, you don't have to use a tag for those. The Drush driver has the advantage of you can run it remotely. And the Drupal driver contains a lot of the step definitions, so most of them are in the Drupal driver. One thing you might run into, which took me more time than I care to admit to figure out in Drupal 8, trying to enter a machine name or a title programmatically. And if you're doing that in a typical Drupal 8 setup, you'll notice when you're putting in the title that JavaScript will make the machine name next to it. And so if you don't have JavaScript running with a Bhat test, you have to fill in the machine name as one of your steps. So it'll fail silently, and you'll be wondering why it's not working. Maybe that's it. Hopefully I can save years of time between everyone here on that one. Comments are just hashtag. You can do multiple lines. Little trick if you have PHP Storm is do command or control / with multiple lines selected to comment out a bunch of lines. If you're trying to figure stuff out and troubleshooting your test, it can be nice to not have to run however many lines of code you have going all at the same time, every time. There is background and tables. So background will basically do your setup at the beginning of a feature, and it'll apply to all of the following scenarios, which is nice. So, and tables are a good fit for that. You can add in multiple pieces of data for each field using a table. So it's good for like generating users or other kinds of content, for just making like dummy content to have for your tests. And then we have context. There are a lot of them, like I said, included with the Bhat Drupal extension. There's the raw. They're broken up into different files, and so you'll see the raw Drupal functionality is the raw Drupal, oddly enough. There is markup for that's for like the HTML tags, not the other tags that we were talking about, and the classes and attributes that go with that. The Drupal context takes care of most of the entity types. The Mint context will deal with typically regions and forms in Drupal. And yeah, messages and Drush. So message is the Drupal messages that you might see like at the top, either success or failures. Drush allows you to call drush. So you can also do custom contexts. This adds a lot of flexibility. You can do probably just about anything with this. There's a featured context.php file where you can add in your own stuff. And a good way to get started with this is just to write the step in the scenario and then run the test. It'll fail, but then it'll give you this little snippet that you can just copy into the feature context file, which is pretty nice. And it'll throw that exception, so you'll see it. If you just leave it in like this, it'll just throw the exception, which is probably not what you want. So nobody likes to see that. So you can just delete the exception, add in the code that you want to have. And it's a combination of PHP, Bhat, and Drupal programming conventions, which we don't really have time to talk about all that right now. But test it again, see if it works. If it works the first time, then you consider yourself lucky. Probably won't. So when you go into debugging, for the steps, there are some steps that you can use. You can print the current URL. You can print the last response, and then you probably would want to take those steps out of your tests in the end. I don't know, maybe you want to leave them in, but they seem like pretty debuggy kinds of steps. You can also use the print R function and then just put the variable in there, and that'll show you what's actually happening, which may or may not be what you think is happening. So there's also an extension for the Drupal Bhat extension. And this is one for Drupal 8. There was one for Drupal 7 too. I didn't share it here because 8 is the cool thing now. So it has all these things. There's the link to it. I'll share this slide, which apparently goes into the margin, one line there. Like I said, there's also subcontext. This is not really used much, but it is possible if you have a contrib module or a theme where you want to add in the subcontext. There's a mechanism for that, and there's good documentation for this on the Bhat extension docs. Similar kind of thing for contributing. There's in part of the repo there has ways that you can do that. You can make your own step definitions and share those on GitHub, or you could create an issue in the issue queue if there was something else that you wanted to see. Not really surprisingly, the maintainer does like to see tests for things that new issues that you want to push up to his project. So. All right, take a look quickly here at visual regression testing, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you just want to jot them down, feel free. So visual regression testing, arguably not actually test-driven here. And that looks a little different in full screen. So, but it's good for if you're making changes. So it's easy to implement with wide coverage. Basically take snapshots of the screen and then compare those to what they were. If you're making changes to core and contrib, you typically won't want to see changes. If you're doing custom development, maybe you do want some changes. So you could expect the test to fail in some scenarios. And so this is kind of what it looks like. It's basically just comparing the two images and then seeing what the differences are there. So you can see in purple where the differences are. You might not be able to see the differences so much as you're looking at the two different images here, but this text wraps a little earlier and it's italicized, so you'll easily be able to see the diff of the changes there. And behind the scenes, it does intersection over a union, not an IOU money kind of thing, but 1 to 0 is the scale, with 1 being exactly the same and 0 being pretty different. And so you can set the threshold for your tests for the amount of difference that you're willing to tolerate between the differences of the images before and after. And that is visual regression testing. Take a look at unit testing now, and this is mostly with PHP units. With test-driven development, we do have a tendency to write tests after the fact, but test-driven development kind of turns that around, where you write the test first and it fails, and then you write the code. And it's nice because it clarifies what needs to be done and also gives you a nice stopping point. So yeah, so you don't do too much, and it works really well with the Agile process that way too. So you do just enough, and you don't take it too far into places where you don't need to go. So a lot going on here. These are the PHP unit suites for Drupal 8. A little table here. So there's unit, kernel, functional, and JavaScript, and they each extend different classes. So I show you in this column what the classes are that they extend. And then there is the state of that Drupal or not Drupal is in at the time that these tests run. So for a unit test, there is no state because you're not even running Drupal. You don't need anything other than really the code base to run the unit test case. With kernel, you need a little bit more. So Drupal is bootstrapped. It's similar to the install screen of Drupal. So you have no modules installed, no configuration. And kernel is good for doing pretty targeted tests, but where you are testing, within the Drupal system. You do have to be able to connect to the database for this, typically, so getting a little bit more involved as we go down the page to functional, which extends the browser test-based class. And this is a state where Drupal is fully booted. So it would be like you were actually in a real Drupal site. You can visit paths, and it's functional and actually similar to the Bhat testing, but just PHP. So, and that requires a web server to run, of course. And then finally, you can basically just put JavaScript on top of that. And so the JavaScript test base extends the browser test base. And again, it's fully booted. In addition to all the other stuff, it uses Phantom.js, and we have a question.
Yeah. Does each component extend the previous one? It's been a while since I looked at the class.
No.
No.
I don't think so.
I think browser extends kernel, but,
Okay.
but I don't remember if kernel extends either.
Yeah. You know, I actually have to check on that. I know that JavaScript extends browser.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I will check on that, and I will put the answer in the Drupal Camp Atlanta session in the description. I will amend the description there. Yeah, so it does get progressively more involved, but it's a good strategy to use as little as you can. So if you can get away with just a unit test, then do it, because it'll be faster, it'll run faster, and it'll be easier. Sometimes there's a little bit of a trade-off between the resources that you're going to use on during the running of the test, which might run a billion times, and then the configuration that you'll have to set up. So as you go up the page, there's typically more configuration that you have to handle. So that's kind of the balance that you want to reach there. So just kind of starting out looking at the unit tests here. It's the simplest, and you basically just you know, see if the output of your function is what you expect. You typically do these assertions here, and so this is what a test might look like. You'll include the class that you want to use, and then extend it here. So this is the name of the class you're testing, and anything that's a test will start with test for the name of the function, and assert equals is probably the most used assertion, I would say. And you'll have an expected value and an actual value. This is always going to be true unless you're in some sort of alternate universe where 1 does not equal 1. So. Some typical assertions here. We had equals, of course, and same. Same is more strict, where if it's comparing objects, it would have to be the same instance of the object, as opposed to just having the same values. Similar to like, you know, like 2 equal signs type of thing. And you can assert true, you can assert false. Those are pretty common. There's a full list in the PHP unit documentation of all of the assertions in that very long link there. You can check them all out. I doubt you'll use them all. So for the kernel tests, because it's similar to when you're at the install screen, there's some setup that you have to do, and some typically configuration to recreate the environmental conditions that you want to have when you're running your test. And the setup will typically happen at the beginning of the class. And similar to like the background in Bhat, it'll apply to all of the test functions that are in the rest of the class. And with the setup, you always set up the parent first, so that it'll inherit any of the setups from any of the ancestry for it. So as far as installing config, there's typically schema, entity schema, and configuration. So the schema here, you can see that you specify the module and then the tables that you want to install. And for the entity schema, it's a little simpler. You can just say the name of the entity ID, which in this case is node. It'll get that set up for you. And then for install config, it's an array of module names, so you can do that fairly easily. And like I said before, here is the parent setup, and you always start with that, so you have the setup ready to go for anything that should be loaded already. Typically, you want to install some fields with the kernel test also. So a nice way to do this is to get it from your configuration management, and this just makes sure that you have the up-to-date configuration. If configuration is changed in your site, you don't have to change it in two places in your CI and, sorry, your CM, lots of C's, and in your test. And then you basically just get that file, and I don't know if you can read this down here, but parse the YAML, and then use that to create the storage config and save it. And then same kind of thing with the field config itself. And so this is like a repeatable thing that you might do a few number of times throughout your test, so it's a great opportunity for a trait, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Another thing you want to typically do is enable some modules, and this is pretty easy to do. You just put it in this array of public static modules variable, and those modules will be enabled. You'll typically do this for kernel and functional tests, including those with JavaScript. So yeah, with functional tests, you have paths. You're fully booted. It's a little bit slower, but you don't need to do as much config. And there is a web assert object class that can be used to make a lot of the assertions here. And this is a link here, so if you want to check out the slides afterwards, you can see all of the different methods that are available there. Here's what a functional test might look like. Similar to the kernel test, but here you can see get the path with Drupal get, and then the path, there's nothing in the path here, so it just gets the home page. And here we use this assert session to be able to use any of those web assert methods. One of them is status code equals 200, which means OK. And here we're just asserting that a link exists with the name blog. And note that that's the human readable label for blog. So You don't have to use like machine names for stuff like this. So when you add JavaScript on top, here are some of the typical functions that are used. Sometimes there won't be any JavaScript in the JavaScript test. It'll just be that the test needs JavaScript to be running in order to work, because it does change the environment a little bit, like that example with the machine name, autocomplete types of things, and others. So there's execute and evaluate scripts are pretty common. The difference between those being that the execute returns the value, which is usually jQuery, and evaluate does not return the value, it just runs the script. So if you don't need the value, you can just evaluate it. Yeah, and a couple other common ones. So resize window is nice if you wanted to test like a specific browser width. If you're trying to see if something was there, you know, with a responsive type of design or something like that, the resize window can work pretty well for that. So the Drupal settings are parsed into an array, and you can get those. You can also create a screenshot from the test base, which is nice to be able to do.
Now, is that only in JavaScript?
I believe so. I believe the create screenshot, I think that's only usable. I only saw it in examples that were extending JavaScript test base, and I looked at every single one of them. At least the ones that were in my installation. Okay. So some typical assertions, assert element visible or not visible, and assert a JavaScript condition, which will wait 10 seconds for that to become true. So it's possible that if it takes more than 10 seconds that you would get an incorrect result. Let's see. So some of the methods typically used with assert session here, wait for these following things. So Ajax to finish, a button or an element to be visible, field or a link. You can wait for autocomplete. You can assert that the response contains or is visible. And so sometimes when you're testing, you don't have the full installation going or configuration, and you want to use test doubles. It's an inexpensive way to get just what you need and nothing more. So you basically here are returning the value without actually having the object there. One way to do this is with mock objects, and this is what it might look like. This is actually a lot simpler than it could be. So you basically just use this get mock builder on the name of the class, that you want to create the mock for. And then you disable the original constructor, which is basically saying, yeah, there was this web form class, but I don't actually want to use web form. I want to fake it, so don't actually construct the web form class. And you set the methods that you need to return values for. So in this case, I only want the ID of the web form for my test. I don't care about anything else. I don't actually need a web form. I just need my test to think that there's a web form, and it needs to have an ID. So then you get the mock, and then you set up what your expectations are. There's this matcher, so you can match it once or any time, any amount of times, one or any number of times, or it might not matter what the matcher is, but there's a whole thing about matchers if you want to look at that. And again, so we're doing this for the ID method, and the value that we want to return value, is a test web form. So what I'm going to get back from this is my web form ID is going to be a test web form. I don't actually have a web form, but my test thinks that I have a web form that's called a test web form. Pretty sweet. I don't know. So yeah, we talked about traits a little bit earlier. This is good for reusing code. You can use it in many classes, and you can group sets of methods also is a good use for that. Traits, of course, cannot be instantiated. That's just like object-oriented PHP stuff. And this would be good, like I said, for the install fields example that we had earlier. One particular type of trait is a reflection trait. And this allows you to test protected and private methods that you otherwise would not be able to test because they're not public. And there's a little bit of a crazy way to get in there, but this is how you do it. Or this is a way to do it, which seems to work. You basically, you have the object, the method, and the parameters that you send into this invoke method. It basically gets the object and then the method and sets it to accessible real quick. And then returns with the parameters. So on the other end of this, in action, we would see where you would invoke the method, put in the object, the method, and then any parameters that you wanted to put in, and magic. Then you'd be able to test your private or protected class. There's also data providers. This allows you to run the same test on different data sets. So here, we'll basically take these variables here, get the sum of a plus b. So we see 1 plus 2 equals 3. This will return true. 4 plus 5 equals 9, true. 7 plus 8 does not equal 9, so that will return false. You can also do name data sets with an associative array. And these are nice because the failure messages will return with the key name here. So false would return false. That's a horrible name. Again, debugging print R is your friend, although it does fail silently, so sometimes it's not your friend. Sometimes I like to do a print R with like a string in front of my print R with the variable, so if nothing returns from the variable, I can at least see that there's nothing. You can also configure screenshots and reports, and you can see messages that you get back if there are errors or failures. Usually pretty good clues into what is or is not happening. And then running the tests themselves, basically just run PHP unit on the command line. It's probably in your like vendor bin, PHP unit, PHP unit, PHP unit. You can add arguments to that. If you use BLT, it's got a cool little command where you can just run it from there. I'm sure there are other scripting languages too, like Ahoy, that make it easy to run PHP. You can have your robot run it with continuous integration, probably a good idea. And if you're like testing on your local, you can just tag test with like @group, and that'd be a good way to just test the current test that you're working on, so you don't have to run a bunch of tests when you're running it 100 times trying to figure out why it's failing. The dot, as you'll see it running, is a pass. It's a good thing. This is like, means you can eat dinner when you see the dot. And then the E is an error, and an F is when the test fails. So those will be big and red. And if you're like me, you see a lot of this. So doing happy and sad paths. It's a good idea to do this. Typically people just test the happy paths where, things that they expect to happen, but you want to test that failures fail also. There's an expect exception that's good for this. So another thing you might want to do as you get farther into it is to use base classes, and this is just kind of good object-oriented practice as well. But if you have a bunch of unit tests and you have some common setups that you want to do, with like certain sets of enabled modules or installed schemas or config or fields, it's a great way to just have to do that once. Similar with like mocks, if you're mocking something. A good example of this is the JSON API contrib module. They have like a base class, and then they extend that. So good stuff. And you can also do nested levels of base classes too if you are super obsessive about doing everything the best possible way that you can. And I think that's about it. If there are any other questions or, okay, have one in back.
How can we run brush commands within Behat test?
So the question is, how can we run drush commands within Behat test? A fine question. So there's the drush driver, and I think with the drush driver, maybe someone can help me out because I haven't actually done this. I've only used the Drupal driver, but I believe that you can just run drush commands, from there if you're using the drush driver. But I don't know if anyone else has. No. Okay. I think that's how you do it. I haven't actually done it, but I've read about people who do it.
With Drupal 8 being better suited for testing, dependency injection, and it seems, this would be a great time if we have some really good testing on Drupal apps we do now. So that said, I'm just curious, is Drupal, because Drupal is so dependent on the database configuration, in BHAT, especially BHAT tests, I mean, does it build, I mean, you got your development database.
Yeah.
I mean, is it basically just you make a clone of an empty clone, or does it trash the tables so that it starts up brand new for each test? Or?
It's a great question. So with Bhat, I've noticed on my local that it will use the database that's on my local.
Development database.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have one on the dev server also, so I'm just differentiating. There's my local development. But yeah, so most of the Bhat steps for Drupal extension will clean themselves up when the test is over, but some will not. And you might be on your development environment and be wondering why there's like all this extra stuff on in your database that looks a lot like the stuff that was in your Bhat test, and that's probably why. I think it's I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's I think it's like taxonomy has to be manually deleted, but nodes will typically delete themselves. If you're not sure if it's getting deleted, you can just run the test and then look and see if the stuff is still there. If it is, you can write cleanup steps as like custom contexts, just to keep things tidy. Or if you don't care, it's fine. Sometimes your tests will get messed up if you run them twice, though, if you don't clean up. So, or if you like run your test and then do some development, you'll have this test data in, and it changes your situation. So it's something to look out for. With PHP Unit, it creates its own database, so you don't have any of that. You can sometimes see the machine name that it creates, and yeah. All right, I think we have about 100 seconds left. If there are any other questions, or maybe it's time. Is it time to party already? Yeah.
Just have some open discussion. How many folks in here actually write tests when they're developing? Do you spend more time writing functional tests, or user acceptance tests, or unit tests?
I have unit tests.
Unit tests? Okay. So I've typically found that I spend more of my time writing functional or user acceptance tests than I do actually writing unit tests. When I'm developing a site, because unit tests are typically written at the module 4 level, and unless I'm writing a custom module, which really not write a unit test, unless I'm writing some complex business logic. Is that, am I the only one that goes down the road, or I'm just curious. So I find a lot of projects don't have tests at all. A lot of Drupal projects don't have tests at all. So I'm just curious as to those folks that are writing a test, what's your test?
I would want to validate that as a good approach, because I think a lot of what we do is using core and contrib that's already has the unit tests in there. We're just doing site building types of things or configuration changes, and you really don't need to unit test that stuff again. In my opinion. So but if you are doing like heavier custom stuff, then you really should be doing the unit testing. But I certainly wouldn't want to takeaway if anyone else has anything else to say about that.
I think I agree that it depends on what you're working on. If you're building custom modules, and that module be used by a very great config or used by many groups with different usage patterns, then you definitely write a lot of unit tests to cover everything.
Right.
And all parameters for every method and everything. And for site-oriented things, maybe for that you have testing or other behavioral testing more appropriate. You can also look at the visual test to have a diff between two different visual diff between two sites before and after you change that could be useful.
That's one line of what my experience has been. We typically run a lot of hat tests, and some functional tests to do a little bit more basic testing of some constructs, but most of it's a hat test, really. That seems to be the most useful when you're building your Drupal site and then just adding some custom components to it and saving your unit test for testing when you're writing complex custom modules that have business logic that needs to be tested and saving unit tests for that.
Right.
Thank you for hijacking my session, and thanks everyone for coming. I guess it's now 4:21, so it might be too late to party. I don't know.